In the winter of 1777, George Washington's soldiers left trails of blood across the snow. Some wrapped rags around their feet because they had no shoes. Others were so sick they could barely stand. More than 2,000 men would die in that camp. And in London, many believed the American rebellion was finally coming to an end. But it didn't, because while the greatest empire on earth waited for surrender, ordinary men stayed alive thanks to meals so simple that few people today would believe it. And the truth is that long before skyscrapers, Wall Street, the White House, and the world's largest economy, fishermen, farmers, sailors, laborers, and pioneers survived because of forgotten foods, some so ordinary that they still go unnoticed today. As we move through this list, the stories become even more remarkable. One of these foods sustained men who vanished in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. Another helped families who crossed unknown forests and cooked squirrels in cast iron pots. And the last one helped keep alive the army that defeated the greatest empire on earth. And perhaps without these forgotten meals,
from
the
these
United
ancient
States would
lines,
never have existed.
a new world emerged.
Be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because every week another forgotten story returns to remind us that the world was built by people history almost forgot. When we think about the founders of the United States, we usually picture George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin. But the truth is that none of them built the country alone. Behind the famous names stood millions of ordinary people. Fishermen freezing in the North Atlantic, farmers struggling to save their crops, sailors disappearing at sea, entire families fighting through harsh winters, men and women who often died without ever realizing that their efforts would help create a nation that centuries later would become the greatest economic and military power on earth. And in many cases, all that stood between those people and death was a simple meal. Number 17, molasses, the fuel of the men who worked the ports. By the early 18th century, cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia were growing rapidly. Ships arrived every day. Goods crossed the Atlantic. Barrels were unloaded without pause. But almost nobody remembers the men who did that work. Dock workers, sailors, and laborers spent up to 15 hours a day battling cold, rain, and disease. They would never become rich. They would never have statues built in their honor. But without them, colonial commerce would have come to a halt. And there was one thing that almost always appeared in their meals: molasses. Imported from the Caribbean, it was cheap, packed with calories, and could be mixed into bread, porridge,
by the
or even eaten
century,
by itself.
These colorful trade routes
Today, it seems like just another ingredient, but
Boston,
for thousands
New York,
of workers,
Philadelphia.
it was fuel. A dock worker who woke up before sunrise, spent hours unloading barrels, and returned home with raw and bleeding hands, didn't wonder whether molasses tasted good. He wondered whether there would be enough food to do it all again the next day. While merchants accumulated wealth and politicians argued about taxes, it was these men, living on bread and molasses, who kept the ports running. And decades later, those same ports would help supply the revolution that gave birth to the United States.
As the mist clears,
but far from the sea, another group faced a much quieter threat. A threat that came from the water itself. Number 16, apple cider, when drinking water could be more dangerous. Today, it's hard to imagine, but in the 18th century, drinking water wasn't always safe.
These are the ripest
Contaminated
we've seen
wells
all season.
spread disease. Epidemics were common. And that's why thousands of families across the 13 colonies drank apple cider every day. Nearly every farm had a few apple trees. Thomas Jefferson maintained large orchards at Monticello. But cider wasn't reserved for the wealthy. Poor farmers in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts relied on it too. In many places, even children drank weaker versions of the beverage. Not because they liked it, because water itself could kill them before lunchtime. By the early 19th century, the average American adult consumed more than 30 gallons of cider every year. It wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. A father who served cider to his 6-year-old son wasn't being irresponsible. He was trying to keep him alive. And nobody thought there was anything unusual about it.
Perfect remedy for the
It was simply another
Indeed,
day
husband.
in colonial America. Those
May the
farmers
snow
rose before
continue all
sunrise,
night.
worked until nightfall,
The turning of
and
the cider
depended
press
entirely
marks the
on their
true
harvest.
beginning of autumn here in
And
the
yet
colonies.
they supplied entire
a tradition
cities
as
and fed a
old as the
rapidly
orchards
growing population.
themselves.
to a bountiful
Meanwhile,
harvest
in the
and
coastal
good
towns,
health.
there was another
Well
food
said.
that today
May
is
the
considered a
winter be
luxury.
mild.
But
Look
back
at
then,
them run.
it was poor people's food.
Fresh
Number
oysters,
15,
right off the boat. Get 'em
oysters,
while they
when the
last.
food of
2
the
shillings a
poor
dozen.
was
Best
everywhere.
price in the city.
Today,
Steaming
ordering
hot,
oysters
ready
at
to
a
eat.
restaurant
Clear
is
the way,
expensive.
coming through.
But in the
These shells
18th
won't move
century,
themselves.
that idea would
How
have
much
made
for the
people
lot?
laugh.
I said, how much
Because
for the
in
lot?
cities like Boston and New York,
hard,
oysters
son.
were among the most common foods for workers and poor families.
It is good to have
Natural
warmth and
oyster
food
beds
on a
were
night like
enormous. Millions of oysters covered entire sections of the coastline. Laborers, dock workers, shipbuilders, and humble families ate oysters regularly. In some markets, they were cheaper than meat. And perhaps the most surprising detail is that New York produced so many oysters that mountains of discarded shells were used to fill land and even pave roads. What is now considered a
From these
sophisticated
ancient
meal
oyster
was
beds,
once just a
the
cheap way
foundations
to
of a
fight
new
hunger.
world metropolis
A
began
man
to
buying
emerge,
oysters for a few
rapidly
cents by the
expanding
docks
along the
could never
harbor.
have imagined that his grandchildren would live in the most influential city on earth. He only knew that he was hungry and that the oysters were there. But even the wealthiest cities in colonial America had an enemy they could not escape: winter. And it was during the long winters of New England that a simple pot of food often decided who would survive until spring. And the next story contains a detail that very few people know. Number 14, baked beans, the meal that carried families through the winter. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, winters in New England were unforgiving. Blizzards could last for days, roads disappeared beneath the snow, harvests stopped producing for months, and when the cold arrived, many families simply stopped leaving their homes. It was under these conditions that baked beans became a matter of survival. Mixed with molasses and cooked slowly in clay pots, they could feed an entire family for several days. It wasn't a luxurious meal, it was an efficient one. Farmers, fishermen, carpenters, and craftsmen depended on it. Men and women of deep faith who built small communities across Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Communities that would later grow into important cities. But life was far from comfortable. During the Great Frost of 1709, one of the harshest winters recorded in the Northern Hemisphere, rivers froze across parts of Europe and temperatures plunged throughout much of North America. Livestock died, harvests failed. But many families survived because they had stored food, and beans were among those life-saving supplies. A mother placing a pot over the fire before dawn wasn't preparing a traditional recipe. She was trying to make sure her children lived long enough to see spring. Decades later, many descendants of those same families would be among the men who fought for independence. But there were times when even beans weren't enough. And it was precisely when everything seemed lost that a plant taught by Native Americans began to make the difference. Number 13, pumpkins, the food that helped save the pilgrims. In September of 1620, the Mayflower
It is
left
so
England
cold down
carrying
here.
just over
The
100
child is
people.
shivering.
Months later, the
We must
pilgrims
pray for
arrived
warmer
in what
weather.
would become Plymouth. They believed they were beginning a new life, but reality was brutal. Disease, cold, hunger, exhaustion. By the end of the first winter, nearly half of the passengers had died.
The morning is
Of the
crisp.
original
Is the
102
stew ready?
travelers,
Almost.
only about 50
We have plenty
survived.
of corn for the day.
And it was at that moment that Native American
Push them down
knowledge
gently
made all
so
the
the earth
difference.
can hold them. Like
The
this?
Wampanoag
Yes, that
people
is good.
taught the colonists how to grow and use several foods. Among them was the pumpkin. It was resilient. It could be stored for months. Its seeds were nutritious. Its flesh could be turned into soups and stews. And almost nothing went to waste. Today, it seems like just another ingredient. But back then, it could mean the difference between life and death. There is a great irony in this story. The men and women who arrived believing they were bringing civilization to the New World ended up being saved by the knowledge of people who had lived there for thousands of years. Without that help, Plymouth itself might have disappeared. and American history might have unfolded very differently. But while some were learning to survive in the countryside, there were families in the cities so poor that every meal had to be carefully divided. And one of those families would raise one of the most important men in Number 12, the oatmeal porridge that fed Benjamin Franklin. When Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston in 1706, no one imagined that the boy would become one of the founding fathers of the United States. His father made candles. His mother cared for a massive family. In total, there were 17 children. Money was scarce, and luxury barely existed. Meals were simple. Often, a single bowl of oatmeal porridge had to feed several people. Today, that seems almost impossible to imagine. But that humble meal helped an entire family keep moving forward. Franklin began working as a child. By the age of 10, he was already helping his father. At 12, he became an apprentice in a printing shop. He never attended college. He wasn't born wealthy. He wasn't part of the elite. But he possessed a curiosity that would change his life. Decades later, he would help draft the Declaration of Independence. He would convince France to support the American cause. He would become an inventor, scientist, diplomat, and one of the brightest minds of the 18th century. And to think that it all began in a home where a simple meal was something to be grateful for. A boy who grew up sharing porridge with 16 siblings would one day help create a nation. But while Benjamin Franklin studied and worked in Boston, there were men living under far harsher conditions. Men who disappeared into endless forests. Men who faced brutal winters. Men who depended entirely on whatever they could hunt. If you enjoyed these forgotten stories, make sure to subscribe to Number 11, Rabbit and Squirrel Stews, the food of frontiersmen. By the early 18th century, much of America was still covered by endless forests. West of the colonies, the land seemed infinite, but it was also dangerous. Hunters, fur traders, and explorers spent weeks, sometimes months, away from civilization. Men like Daniel Boone, born in 1734, crossed regions few others dared to enter. They didn't travel with wagons full of food. They relied on the hunt. Deer, wild turkeys, rabbits, and even squirrels. Today, that sounds strange. But back then, it was simply another day of life on the frontier. The meat was cooked slowly in large cast iron pots, mixed with roots, herbs, and whatever vegetables were available. It became simple stews that could feed men for days. But frontier life was brutal. Accidents, disease, storms, attacks, harsh winters. Many never made it back home. And still, new groups kept moving west. Without realizing it, they were opening routes that would later become Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio.
The pressure to expand
A man
beyond the
cooking a
13
squirrel
colonies
over
was
a
immense.
campfire deep in the woods had no idea that his children would one day live in a country that would become a continental power. He was simply trying to survive one more winter. But while some men vanished into the forests, others faced something
Before the
even
states
more
of Kentucky,
terrifying.
Tennessee, and
The
Ohio
North
were
Atlantic.
formed.
Number 10, dried cod, the fish that made New England rich. Long before Wall Street, long before oil, long before American industry, there was cod. In the 18th century, New England fishermen faced some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. Leaving from Massachusetts and Maine, their ships sailed toward the icy waters near
As the
Newfoundland.
harsh New England winter
Storms were
closed in,
unpredictable.
the women of the
Massive
colonies
waves
endured
destroyed ships. Some vessels disappeared completely, and families waited. They waited for weeks. They waited for months. And sometimes they never received any news. Still, when spring returned, other men sailed again, because entire towns depended on that fish. The cod was salted and dried to last for months. Then it was sold throughout Europe, the Caribbean, and the colonies. Benjamin Franklin once said that cod was one of New England's greatest treasures, and he wasn't exaggerating. While many people imagine that America's wealth began with banks and factories, much of it started with men freezing in the North Atlantic. Men who never became famous, but men who built an economy strong enough to support a future revolution. And remarkable as that may sound, there was an even simpler food. A food that accompanied farmers, merchants, explorers, and even soldiers. A food so practical that many men carried it for days. Number 9. Johnny cake, the bread that traveled with a nation. Long before railroads, every journey was an adventure. Farmers traveled miles to sell their goods. Messengers crossed the colonies carrying news. Explorers disappeared into the wilderness for weeks. And everyone needed food that was simple, cheap, and long-lasting. That's how Johnny cake became part of American life. Made primarily from cornmeal and water, it had its roots in Native American traditions. It required no yeast, no expensive ingredients, and it could be cooked quickly over a fire. Today, it sounds too simple, but thousands of people survived because of it. Farmers carried Johnny cakes on long journeys. Merchants packed them into wagons. Explorers ate them in makeshift camps. Even soldiers of the Continental Army came to depend on them. It was practically a portable loaf of bread. But there is a great irony in that, because many of the men who would later help build the United States depended on native knowledge that Europeans had initially ignored. A traveler carrying Johnny cakes in his bag had no idea that he was crossing land that would one day belong to one of the most powerful nations in history. He only knew that he still had many miles ahead of him. But while travelers carried their corn cakes, millions of families faced another problem. How do you keep food from disappearing before the next winter? And it was there that simple methods of preservation began to decide who would live to see spring. And that is where our story begins to enter its most remarkable chapters. While travelers carried Johnny. Number 8. Smoked meat, the food that had to last until spring. Long before electricity and refrigeration, preserving food was a matter of survival. On farms throughout Virginia, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, entire families prepared for the cold months ahead. Pigs were slaughtered. Some cuts were packed with salt. Others were hung inside wooden smokehouses, where they absorbed smoke for days. The process wasn't sophisticated, but it worked. When snow covered the fields and hunting became difficult, that meat became one of the few guarantees against hunger. It was the food of farmers, blacksmiths, small landowners, men who walked before sunrise and worked until dark. A family entering winter without enough smoked meat wasn't simply unprepared. They were in danger. And every father knew that as he carefully cut and preserved each piece, thinking about the months ahead. Few of these people would ever become wealthy. Most would never leave their hometowns. But they were the ones who fed the colonies for generations. While the great names of American history fill the books, thousands of ordinary families spent their lives worrying about something much simpler, keeping their children alive through another winter. And among those families, another humble food became part of nearly every meal. A food so common that few people today realize how important it once was. Number 7. Whole grain bread, the meal of ordinary men. In the 18th century, white bread was expensive. Most people ate dark, heavy bread that looked nothing like what we know today. Farmers ground wheat by hand. Nothing was wasted. The flour retained nearly every part of the grain. And that bread sustained millions of people. On small farms throughout the 13 colonies, meals were simple. Bread, preserved meat, a few vegetables, nothing more. A carpenter who woke before dawn, quietly ate a piece of dark bread and went off to work, wasn't thinking about revolution. He was thinking about paying his debts, about finishing the day, about making sure his children had something to eat the next morning. But those same men answered the call in April of 1775 when the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. Blacksmiths, carpenters, millers, farmers, ordinary men. Men who had never imagined standing against the most powerful empire on earth. Not because they saw themselves as heroes, but because someone had to do it. And if bread sustained the men who would fight for independence, there was another food even more important. A food that literally saved the colonies from disappearing. And its story begins during one of the darkest chapters in early American history. A period so desperate that historians are still astonished by what happened. Number 6. The corn that prevented the colonies from disappearing. When Jamestown was founded in 1607, the English believed they were creating a new England. But they quickly discovered that America was not Europe. The land was different. The seasons were different. The farming methods were different. And in 1609, one of the darkest periods in American history began.
Yes,
The
now
starving
press the soil
time.
down.
During that terrible winter, hunger swept through the colony. Of the roughly 500 settlers, only 60 survived. People ate horses, they ate dogs, they ate rats, and records from the time even described cases of cannibalism. It seemed like the end.
Originating
Many
in
believed
the
Jamestown would
cultivation
simply
of corn
disappear.
quickly spread throughout the colonies,
But the
reaching
Powhatan
as far
people
west as
already
Monticello
understood
and
that
the
land.
Appalachian foothills.
They knew how to grow
As the
food.
sun rises
They
over
knew how to
these
preserve
fields,
it. And they
we
knew
see
that
the dawn
one
of
plant
a
in
new
particular
nation,
could sustain
forged
entire
in the
communities.
spirit of survival.
Corn. At first, many English settlers resisted. They believed European wheat was superior. But hunger has a way of crushing pride. Little by little, the colonists learned. And from that crop came porridge, cakes, and bread. Decades later, George Washington would grow corn at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson would do the same at Monticello. Poor farmers depended on it.
We are grateful
Workers
for your
depended
help
on
with
it.
the harvest.
Soldiers depended on it.
The
Nearly
yield is
everyone
bountiful
depended
this
on it.
year.
And there was a profound irony in that.
Stored deep
Many of the
within
men
the
who would
beams,
later help create
this
the United
corn
States
represented the
survived
community's
because they learned from
survival
people who
through
had
the winter
already lived
months.
on that land for thousands of years. Without that knowledge, the colonies might never have become a nation. But if corn saved the colonies, the
We are
next foods
truly
would sustain
blessed to
men
have this
facing
meal
something
together.
even more difficult. One of them was so hard that soldiers called it toothbreakers. Another kept families alive as they vanished into unknown forests. And the last one helped prevent the American Revolution from dying during the coolest winter of the war. Number 5. Salted meat. The food of the men who kept the colonies alive. In the 18th century, salt meant far more than seasoning. It was survival. Across the port cities and farms of the 13 colonies, enormous barrels of salted beef and pork were prepared to feed sailors, merchants, fishermen, and soldiers, because journeys could last for weeks, sometimes months. And once a ship left port, there was no resupply. It was either salted meat or hunger. Life at sea was brutal. Scurvy, storms, disease, accidents, and sometimes entire
This
ships
animated
simply
map
vanished
reveals
into the
intricate
Atlantic.
web of the
When that
triangle
happened,
trade,
a family in
linking
Boston or Philadelphia would wake up one day without a father, without a son, without a brother, and without answers. Only silence and an empty chair at the table. Still, when spring returned, new men boarded those ships because entire cities depended on trade, and that trade strengthened the colonies. It transported weapons, gunpowder, supplies, and eventually helped sustain the American Revolution itself. Without those men, perhaps the war would have ended before it truly began.
We need 3 more
But
of
if
the rum
salted
barrels
meat
over there.
kept men alive at sea,
Moving them now.
soldiers fighting for independence would soon discover something even stranger. Something so hard that many broke their teeth trying to eat it. Number 4.
I swear this hardtack
the
gets harder
biscuit
every year.
that broke teeth.
Just gnaw
When
on
George
it, man.
Washington took
Better than
command of the
nothing.
Continental Army in 1775, he quickly realized the Americans lacked almost everything. They lacked money, they lacked factories, they lacked
we are.
resources,
Took long enough.
and so they improvised.
Hard-won meal, eh?
That was how one of the most famous foods in military history became part of daily life. Hardtack, a simple biscuit made from flour, water, and salt. Nothing more.
This one's huge.
In
Maybe
theory,
it counts as
it was
meat.
perfect.
Call 'em
It could
breakfast.
last for years. In practice,
it is, I'm too
it was
tired to care.
almost as hard as stone. Soldiers called them toothbreakers. Some smashed them against rocks before trying to eat them. Others soaked
As
them
the
in
sun
coffee or
rose over
soup
the
for
frozen
several
valley,
minutes to
the
soften them.
Continental Army stirred.
And there was another
Despite the biting
unpleasant
cold,
surprise.
they prepared for the
Worms.
coming fight.
Another night
insects,
passed.
larvae.
Barely.
Some soldiers joked
My
that they
feet are
were
still
extra
numb.
protein because laughing was easier than complaining. And even then, they kept eating because the alternative was starvation. Number 3, stews made from rabbits, squirrels, and anything they could hunt. While George Washington fought in the East, thousands of families pushed farther into the frontier. America seemed endless, but it was also unforgiving.
We need more wood!
There were
Hurry,
no
the
cities,
children are freezing.
no hospitals,
Watch out for the drift.
no roads. Wagons broke down, disease spread, children died, and many adults never reached their destination. When supplies ran out, hunting became the only option. Squirrels, rabbits, wild turkeys, raccoons, anything they could catch.
Here you
The
go,
meat
eat
was
well.
placed into cast
Thank you,
iron
Mom.
pots and turned
keeping
into
the
simple
cold out.
stews. A mother cooking squirrel stew over an open fire in the middle of the wilderness, surrounded by hungry children, wasn't choosing dinner. She was choosing whether her family would continue or give up.
In the early days
And
of the
many
Republic,
chose to continue.
it was the resilience of
Daniel
families
Boone
that
and
forged
countless
the
other
future of this
frontiersmen
land.
lived that way. Entire families crossed the Appalachian Mountains carrying everything they owned. Many disappeared. Others froze. Some were never seen again. But those who survived opened the roads to Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and countless other regions. Regions that would later become states. States that would provide farmers, soldiers, industries, and resources that helped transform the United States into a continental power. And to think that all of it was built by people who, in many moments, were simply trying to find something to put into a pot. But remarkable as those stories are, the final 2 foods on this list sustained men who literally changed the course of world history. One helped save entire colonies from destruction, and the other kept. Number 2, cornbread, the food the English learned from Native Americans. When Jamestown was founded in 1607, the English believed they were creating a new England. But they quickly discovered that America was not Europe. The land was different. The climate was
You
different.
must grind until it is fine like
The
this.
seasons were different.
Then add the water slowly.
And the farming
like
methods
so,
they had brought
and knead
with
the
them
dough well.
often failed. Then, in 1609, one of the darkest chapters in early American history began. The starving time. Out of roughly 500 settlers, only 60 survived.
From its
People ate
origins
horses.
in Jamestown, the
They ate
cultivation of
dogs.
corn spread rapidly
They
throughout
ate
the
rats.
colonies. This humble
And records from the
cornbread
time
sustained
even
them,
described
a
cases of
symbol of
cannibalism.
survival as the first colonies began
For
to
a while,
thrive in
it
the
seemed
vast
certain
new
that
world.
Jamestown
the
would
dawn breaks
disappear.
over the Powhatan River,
But the
illuminating a
Powhatan
scene of
people
unlikely
understood that
peace in the
land
New
far
World.
better than any European.
Here, the harvest
They knew how to grow food. They knew how to preserve it. And they knew that one crop, above all others, could sustain entire communities. Corn. At first, many English settlers resisted. They believed European wheat was superior. But hunger has a way of crushing pride.
The harvest was bountiful
Little by
this year,
little,
praise
they
be to
lowered.
God. Hey, enough to last the
And
winter,
from corn
perhaps.
came
You
porridge,
must see it
cakes,
stored
and
before the
eventually
real cold sets
cornbread.
in.
A simple food, an inexpensive food, but one capable of feeding thousands. Decades later, George Washington grew corn at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson did the same at Monticello. Poor
We offer
farmers
this
depended
corn
on
in
it.
trade.
Thank you.
Laborers depended on it.
These blankets will keep
Soldiers
you warm
depended
this
on
winter.
it. Nearly
here
everyone
in the
depended
fertile
on it.
valleys of the colonial frontier.
And there is an extraordinary
life revolved around
irony
the
in that.
rhythm of the land and the
Many
endless
of the men
bounty
who
of
would
the
later help
cornfields.
create the United States survived because they embraced the knowledge of people who have lived on that land for thousands of years before Europeans ever arrived. Without that knowledge, perhaps the colonies themselves would never have survived. But if corn prevented the colonies from disappearing, the food that holds the #1 spot prevented something even greater from dying. It prevented the American Revolution itself from collapsing. Number 1, the pea soup that helped save the Revolution. December 1777. The American Revolution had entered its 3rd year. Defeats had shattered morale. Philadelphia had fallen into British hands. Supplies were scarce, and Congress struggled to provide food, clothing, and money. When George Washington led roughly 12,000 men into Valley
suffering
Forge,
of the
Pennsylvania,
troops is unbearable.
many believed the rebellion
How
had
can we
reached
long
its
endure?
end. But the greatest enemy waiting there wasn't the British Army. It was winter. Temperatures plummeted. The crude log huts provided
brother.
little protection.
Get some warmth in
Clothing
you.
was inadequate.
Thank you.
Some soldiers wrapped pieces of cloth around their feet because they had no shoes.
We lost
Officers
3 more
recorded
overnight.
trails of blood staining the snow.
God help us, Doctor.
George Washington wrote desperate
sickness
letters to
spreads
Congress,
faster than the
warning
frost.
that the army itself might
Attention,
disappear
gentlemen!
if food
Recover
shortages
arms!
continued.
Right dress!
Disease spread everywhere. Typhus, pneumonia, dysentery, smallpox. More than 2,000 men died in that camp. Back in London, many believed the rebellion would simply collapse on its own. It seemed only a matter of time. But the survivors endured. And on many days, the only thing available was a simple soup. Dried peas, small pieces of salted meat, flour, and whatever
By
vegetables
the
could be
left,
found.
face! Shoulder your
Nothing anyone
firelocks!
would expect to change the
Present,
course of history.
arms!
But those steaming bowls kept men alive. Blacksmiths, farmers, teachers, merchants, immigrants, ordinary men. Men who only a few years earlier
This
had
was the
never
crucible
imagined
of the
taking up
Continental
arms against the
Army.
greatest empire
A
on
winter
earth.
encampment where
And
survival
then
itself
something
was the
extraordinary
truest
happened.
measure of a soldier's
While
resolve.
hunger and cold claimed thousands of lives, a Prussian officer named Friedrich von Steuben began training the survivors. The men who emerged from Valley Forge were
As the
when
sun
we
rises,
think about the
we
United
witness
States
centuries of
as the
change in
world's
mere
greatest
moments,
economic,
revealing the
military,
vast-
and technological power, it is easy to picture skyscrapers, universities, Wall Street,
A new
NASA,
day dawns
aircraft
over the
carriers,
colonies,
and
painting the
multinational
quiet
corporations.
farms and
But none of those things existed in the beginning. There were only ordinary people. Fishermen freezing in the North Atlantic. Dock workers unloading ships in busy ports. Farmers praying for a successful harvest. Families struggling through endless winters. Explorers disappearing into unknown forests. And soldiers bleeding into the snow at Valley Forge. Men and women who often died without ever understanding the magnitude of the legacy they would leave behind. Because they
As
were
the
not
golden
trying to
sun
build the
rises
most
over the
powerful
endless
nation in
forests,
history.
the
They were simply trying to survive until tomorrow. And perhaps that is what makes these forgotten foods so important. Because they did not sustain presidents. They sustained ordinary
Good
people.
morrow to you, Thomas.
Men who
And to you,
vanished
Mr.
at sea.
Davies. A fine
Women
morning
cooking
indeed.
inside isolated cabins. Children growing up in homes where a simple bowl of porridge was something to be grateful for. Soldiers who bled on the frozen ground of Valley Forge. And without realizing it, those people were building something none of them would live long enough to fully see. The country that would
Much
become the
obliged for
greatest
mending the plough,
economic,
Elias.
military,
Think
and
nothing of it,
technological
Thomas.
power of
It'll
the
serve you
modern
well.
age. And perhaps the most remarkable part of all is that before the skyscrapers, before Wall Street, before the White House, before aircraft carriers, and before the United States became the most powerful nation on earth, there were only ordinary people, a pot over the fire, and the hope of making it to tomorrow.